We're going to transition to a time of teaching this morning, and we are in a series this month talking about the color value of relationships. And we've borrowed some terminology from the world of art, which none of us pastors are really very artistic, so it's kind of ironic. But we appreciate color and what it brings to our lives, because what would be a piece of art without color? And color value brings all this different dimension. If you have ever been to a paint store and had to pick out one color, you know how much variety and how much beauty there is in color. And so it's all of that difference of color. I mean, we really start with three basic colors and we create this whole panorama of choices of color. But that's what brings beauty and dimension and depth to our life and to art and even to our relationships. Now, it doesn't transfer as well when we think about our relationships being all this different colors. We kind of maybe bristle at that, like, well, yeah, but people who are different from me, like, that's a whole different thing, right? Because when we have differences in our relationships, it gets a little tougher to accept that. But hopefully we'll see through this series and through this morning as well that all of those differences that we see around us really are a beautiful thing. We've been over a couple things in this series that if you haven't had a chance to catch those first two, I encourage you to go back to our website, lhwc.org, excuse me, and catch those. The first week, Pastor Kirby did a fantastic job of covering the difficult topic of divorce. I mean, sometimes the differences in our relationships take us to places and we respond to differences in ways that we don't necessarily want to go. And the message that he shared on that, I think, was very healing. I think it was one of hope. And I again encourage you to go back to that. And last week, Pastor Nathan graciously switched weeks with me, and he shared some practical tips for healthy relationships. And so no matter where our relationships are at, if we're in a time of peace or if we're in a time of struggle, all of those things that he shared can be helpful to helping us have healthy relationships. And so today we're going to talk about our differences in light of personality and how our personalities they can help us find value in all of the differences, because we're not all the same, right? I mean, for example, there are real people who actually organize their sock drawer. Now, that may not be you, but there are people like that. And there are people who, when they face a crisis, they actually thrive rather than crumble. And we have people in our world who are just so natural at caring for and showing love to other people. And then we have what sometimes we call geeks, but really affectionately, they're people who will lose themselves in research to arrive at the best possible solution when it comes to fighting illness and disease. And so when we can learn to value all of these differences and see what they offer to the world, it helps lead to healthier and holier relationships. Now, for most of my life, I really didn't know what to do with other people's differences. So it's kind of a sad thing to even say. But it was easier to believe that everybody was just like me, and to live that everybody, to live the way, believing that everybody was just like me, because why not? You all agree, right? I need to go back and listen to Pastor Nathan's points on humility from last week, because they kind of hit close to home. But if I came across people that were different from me, and I didn't really know what to do with them. And so I didn't really do anything with them. But then about 12 years ago, I was introduced to a tool that changed the way that I view relationships. And it helped to make my relationships healthier and holier. And I'm not going to tell you that it solved all of my relationship problems, okay? I'm not an expert, and this isn't going to answer all of the questions, but it gives us a tool. It gives me a tool. It's a starting point to understanding myself and my place in this world, which is really where all personality theory begins. See, for as long as mankind has existed, we've been driven to answer two basic questions. Who am I, and why am I here? And these questions really get at the heart of personality, because we start to realize that, well, we're not all the same, so why the differences? What's the point of the differences? And as Christians, we come from an understanding that God has created us for a unique and specific purpose. And Christ saved us so that we could fulfill that purpose. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, it tells us that we are God's masterpiece. He created us anew in Christ Jesus so that we can do the good things he planned for us long ago. So we've all been created with a specific purpose and these things that God has us to do. And when we begin to understand our personality, it's a key piece to understanding who we are and why we're here. Many of you have probably benefited from a personality assessment before, and they're helpful in helping us understand ourselves, and they're also helpful for understanding and deepening our relationships with other people, who other people are and why they are here. And I think that understanding our personality even helps give us a deeper relationship with God, because we're not all meant to have the same kind of, we all are meant to know God's love, but we're all going to express that differently. And when we understand our personality, it gives us the freedom to love God and serve him in a way that is aligned with and meaningful to our personality. So in the last, well, actually more than 12 years, but from the time I, didn't know what to do with people's differences until now, I've had some recovery, and so I want to take you on that little journey of recovery so that it'll help you maybe get to a point where we're not just acknowledging and tolerating people's differences, but we can actually embrace them and see them as the beauty of which they are. So, the first step in any recovery program is to acknowledge that there's a problem. So this happened for me when I went to college, because again, I lived most of my life just assuming everybody was the same as me, and I went to college and I discovered these people who were different from me. Crazy, right? And I had a friend who helped me take this first step of acknowledging the differences. And he was my friend from Australia. His name was Malcolm, and I remember sitting in the cafeteria many days having these conversations about discovering differences and what do they mean and what do we do with them. And his phrase that he would repeat over and over again, he says, different isn't wrong, it's just different. Now he said it with a nice Australian accent, but I don't have that. So say that with me. Different isn't wrong, it's just different. Now, before we carry that too far, let me just pause for a moment and acknowledge that there are some things that are wrong. We can't use this statement to just turn a blind eye to everything, okay? The Bible, God has given us some very clear guidelines of things that we should do, things that we should not do. The 10 Commandments, okay? Very clear things. We don't see someone go off on a shooting spree and say, well, different isn't wrong, it's just different. Okay, murder is wrong, no matter how you look at it. So, but there are so many things in the Bible that are left up to kind of our own interpretation. They're not spelled out clearly, and there are some things that aren't even mentioned at all. The Bible isn't going to tell you what color to paint your living room. So those kinds of differences is kind of where we're going to spend our time today, and those things aren't wrong. They're just different. We don't all see things the same way. You've probably heard of, if there's a crime scene or an accident and officers are trying to gather information and talk to some eyewitnesses, and two people saw the exact same thing happen but tell a very different story. We've got another picture I'll put up on the screen to illustrate that we don't see things the same way. So how many of you see an old woman in this picture? Raise your hand. It's okay, nothing's going to happen to you. How many see a young woman in the picture? Well, some people are able to see both, like you're the really bright ones in the room. But we're looking at the same image, and we see two different things. So we have these different perspectives. We have different likes and dislikes. I hate black licorice. It happens to be my husband Jeff's one of his favorite things. So I'm okay with that, right? Different isn't wrong. It's just different until he decides to eat it in the car next to me and I have to smell it. Then it might be wrong. We have different opinions and beliefs, and we can feel very strongly about those. For instance, what direction the toilet paper gets put on the roll. We have different perceptions of time. If I tell you that an event starts at 7 p.m. and you arrive right on the dot, 7 o'clock, are you on time? Are you early? Or are you late? We all perceive things differently. And so these differences, and those much more significant than these, can be traced back to our personality. And so psychologists over the years have come up with some different models. Some will say there's 4 personalities, some will say there's 16, there's anywhere in between. But they have allowed us to generalize behaviors and find some common factors that we can kind of put people into certain groups. And so the idea is that we're born with a core temperament, a core personality. And there are pieces of all the others mixed in, so we're not just one personality, but we're a mixture. That's that color value idea again. But then that core temperament is influenced by our environment. It's influenced by the people that we're raised with. It's influenced by our education, by our socioeconomic background, where we live. And so our personality becomes very complex, and it influences almost everything that we do. And it creates these differences. And so we have to acknowledge that we have these differences. For instance, some people use a calendar and plan out their entire week or day, sometimes even their hour, and other people think that calendars are a waste of paper. So we have to accept that that's different. When it comes to money management, some people are savers, some people are spenders. How we express our anger is influenced by our personality. Some people are really physical and verbal and aggressive. Other people need to withdraw. Other people need to cry. It's all just differences that aren't right or wrong. They're just different. So that's the first step in this road to recovery about differences, is acknowledging that different isn't wrong. It's just different. The next step then is to bring it a little bit closer and accept. And what we're accepting is that our differences are God's design. So rather than, bristling at the differences, we need to learn to think about how God created. Just think about, other than people, think about what God created. He used a variety of colors and smells and textures and landscapes and climates. There's so many different kinds of plants and animals. And when we get to the human race, we see another display of his creativity with hair or not, or skin color, or body shapes and sizes. It's all part of God's design. So imagine if everything were all one color, or if all of our food tasted the same. God designed all these differences, and it's a reflection. So when we see these differences in creation and in one another, it's a reflection of the glory and grandeur and vastness of who God is. The prophet Isaiah taught that every person was created by God's design. In Isaiah 64, verse 8, "And yet, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are the potter. We are all formed by your hand." So we're all the handiwork of God's own hands. He formed you, and he formed me, and he formed people who are different from us for his pleasure. Well, if you got someone in your mind, you're thinking, really? Revelations 4:11 is a section of a scene a vision that John was given of what's happening in heaven, and the angels are praising God, and part of their praise, they say, "For you, God, created all things, and they exist because you created what you pleased." So everything that is created is the way that God wanted it to be. Every person who is created is the way that God wanted them to be. And the way that you are formed and put together is the way that God wanted it to be. You're God's masterpiece, created specifically to do the good things that he has planned for you. And they're going to be different from the person next to you. But that person next to you is still someone who was created by God for a specific purpose, to do the good things he has planned for them. And that person in your class or at your job who waits until the last minute to finish their part of the team project is also God's masterpiece, approaching life with adventure and spontaneity and boldness. And the person in your life that maybe you think is highly sensitive is also God's masterpiece, bringing compassion, sincerity, and encouragement to the hurting people and places in our world. So those ideas have implications for every day, but think of this on a grander scale. God knew that we needed each other and all of our differences in order for the mission of the church to be carried out in the world. He assembled a team of 12 disciples with different personalities and told them to go into the world and teach people to know and love God. See, God knew that it was going to take different kinds of people to reach different kinds of people. And Paul spent a lot of time coaching the early church on how to accept these differences within the church so that the purpose and the mission that God had could be carried out in the world. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 6, he tells them there are different ways that God works through people, but it's the same God. God works in all of us, in everything that we do. And so that's part of accepting these differences, because I may come across someone who has a need or a problem, and I might not really, I can try, but I might not be able to connect with them. But then you come along and they cross your path, and because of your background, your experiences, your personality, it works. And so it becomes this beautiful design that God has so that we can care for others, because caring for others is also part of God's design. The New Testament has over 50 statements of how we are to care and how to treat one another. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, it tells us, don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. So we have to consider the interests of others, the good of others, recognizing that they're going to come at life with a different perspective and a different perception from us. So we can accept that our differences are God's design, and then we can take the third step, which is to applaud. We can choose to let our differences tear us down, or we can choose to let our differences build us up, which is God's design, to build each other up. So we have a choice in every relationship of what we're going to choose. And if we, as Christians, let our differences divide us, it not only hurts that relationship, but it will impact the mission of the church. And so it's vital that we embrace our differences as part of God's design and be able to build each other up. This is a hard step. It's very hard to do. It's one thing to acknowledge, okay, different isn't wrong, it's just different, and I accept that differences are God's design. But to really applaud that and turn it on its head and celebrate the differences of other people, it's hard. But until we can get to that place, our relationships are going to be managed by tension. And we will not be able to carry out what God desires for our relationships. And so understanding personality is going to help us understand what other people value. It's going to help us understand what they need It's going to help us understand what brings them joy, and we can contribute to that. It's going to help us see what strengths they bring to the table. And it will help us to be intentional about truly helping people, even down to choosing the words that we say. And the words that we say are powerful. In Ephesians 4:29, it says, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." So if we're going to communicate according to someone else's needs, we have to have an understanding of what their needs are and be able to know what's going to benefit them, what they need, what they value, what brings them joy. Because, for example, if someone's having a bad day, we all need different things to work through that. And so if what I need on a bad day is I need to have space by myself and I need to have quiet, and I assume that that's what you need too when you have a bad day, well, you might be a person that feels that as rejection because you need to be with people. You need someone to just be present with you. So if I give you what I need, it's not going to be helpful. It's not going to be beneficial to you. We take different approaches when we work as a team together on projects and goals, and we can frustrate each other with that, or we can learn to value why someone else maybe operates on that time frame or sees a deadline differently than we do. In our families, we talk about the idea of the 5 love languages. This is, again, helping people, communicating with them in a way that benefits them and is helpful according to their needs, not just according to our own. And so when we bring these differences together, it becomes a powerful tool for God to use, because we might see something happen that we thought was impossible because I couldn't do it. But when all these other gifts and personalities and things that God has put together, when they all come together, it changes the story. Think about with me, it's hard to imagine what it's like to not be able to fly, right? I mean, back in the 1930s when the Wright brothers took their first flight, it was a pretty big deal. It took thousands of years for us to be from creation until the time that we could fly. That's a long time. It took them to figure that out. So from there until we were able to go from that flight to get on the moon was only about 60 years. It's pretty remarkable, isn't it? Like, it takes thousands of years to figure out how to just get this little thing off the ground, but then 60 years later, we're going to the moon. So back in the 1930s, it took somebody with a bold, daring idea to even suggest the preposterous idea that, what if we could go to the moon? Can you imagine the ridicule they must have endured? But then it took this person, this team of people who was like, you know what? Let's really research this. Let's dig in. Let's tear this apart and let's see if it's really feasible. Once they determined it was feasible, we needed people who were careful about the details to make sure that every I was dotted and every T was crossed so that we could get our men and women there and back safely. And then there were the people who said, well, let's make sure that they're comfortable. We have to take care of our people. We have to make sure that they have food and a place to sleep and a way to communicate with us. It took all of these different personalities to do something that seems incredible and put a man on the moon. Think about what that could mean in the church. If we acknowledge that different isn't wrong, it's just different, and we accept that our differences are God's design, and then we applaud the differences we see in others and figure out how to build them up. Because in the church, we need people who will dream the impossible. And we need the people who will come behind that and look at all different angles of it and create a strategy to bring that dream to life. And we need the people who are going to make those detailed lists and keep everything moving so that we're on schedule. And we need the people who will remind us of the purpose and the significance of why we're doing what we're doing so that people can ultimately know about the living hope in Jesus Christ. So what it's all about. And so my hope for you is that from now on, when you see people's differences, you won't see a problem that has to be fixed, but that you will see a possibility of what God can do when he puts all of our differences together. I told you that there was this tool that helped me in my recovery process, and this tool is the Real Colors personality assessment that we've listed in your bulletin. And this is one of my favorite things to do, really is, to talk about the value that each personality has. And it's a good reminder for me because sometimes I forget and don't see the differences of people the way that I should. And so last Wednesday, I spent a couple hours with some high school students, and we had a great time. I promised them that it would be fun. They told me I delivered. So if you're not really sure, you can ask some high school students, like, was it really fun? Because I promise you, it will be fun. It will be practical. And we're going to come away with just, I think, a broader understanding of an appreciation for who people are. And we're not able to obviously offer it to the whole church. We've got limited materials available, but if it's something that you would like to do, fill out your connection card and write Real Colors on there and leave that in the baskets as you leave. And we'll be sure I'll be getting in touch with you with some extra details about that. As you leave this morning, you'll have a chance, obviously, to leave your connection cards. And if you're a regular attender and you've determined what you're going to give to God financially as part of your worship and service, you may leave that in the baskets. And if you're a guest with us, that's not something we expect from you. We're just glad that you're here, that you're joining us on this journey, and we just want to connect with you. Would you allow me to pray with us, and then the worship team will come back for a closing song. Lord God, your creativity is so incomprehensible. As we look around, I mean, we don't understand why you created snow, but it is pretty, and the drifting just creates some beautiful things. But God, in our own lives, we see these differences, and we see sometimes we don't react or respond to them in the right way. So gently remind us by your Spirit that the differences we see in others are your design and actually intended to accomplish something beautiful that you have planned from long ago. And I look around this room, God, and I see this beautiful tapestry that you've put together and called Living Hope Church. And you've put us in this community. And we look forward, God, to what you want to do, what you will do when we allow our differences to come together to build each other up. And we will give you all the praise and all the glory. In Jesus' name.